Commander Ryan Torres stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the exclusive Navy Officers Club overlooking San Diego Harbor, watching the sunset paint the Pacific Fleet in golden hues. His dress uniform was immaculate, every ribbon and medal precisely positioned to showcase 15 years of distinguished naval service. At 35, Ryan had achieved more than most officers twice his age. Command of his own destroyer, commendations for tactical excellence, and a reputation as one of the Navy's rising stars. He was a man accustomed to winning, whether in naval operations or in life itself. Competition was the fuel that drove him, the force that had propelled him from a small-town kid in Ohio to the upper echelons of military command. Tonight, surrounded by fellow officers celebrating the successful completion of a joint training exercise, Ryan felt that familiar surge of satisfaction that came with being at the top of his game. "Torres, you magnificent bastard!" Lieutenant Commander Jake Mitchell approached with 2 glasses of aged whiskey, his voice carrying the easy camaraderie of men who had served together through multiple deployments. Jake was Ryan's closest friend in the service, a helicopter pilot whose daredevil reputation was matched only by his loyalty to his wingmen. "Another successful operation," Ryan said, accepting the glass and raising it in a mock toast. "The Admiral was impressed with our coordination during the amphibious assault simulation." Jake's expression shifted, a mischievous glint appearing in his eyes that Ryan had learned to recognize over their years of friendship. It was the same look Jake had worn before suggesting they liberate a case of beer from the officers' mess during their academy days, or when he'd proposed the infamous poker game that had cost 3 senior officers their monthly pay. "You know, Torres," Jake began, swirling his whiskey thoughtfully, "watching you operate out there, I couldn't help but think about how you approach everything like a military campaign. Every challenge, every obstacle, you analyze it, develop a strategy, and execute with precision." Ryan frowned slightly, sensing there was more coming. "That's what makes a good commander, Mitchell. Thorough planning and decisive action." "True," Jake agreed, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. "But I've been wondering, is there any challenge you wouldn't take on? Any mission you'd consider too difficult or too unconventional?" The question hung in the air between them like the first shot fired in a naval engagement. Ryan felt his competitive instincts stirring, the same drive that had pushed him to excel at every level of his career. He studied Jake's face, trying to read the tactical situation developing before him. "Depends on the parameters of the mission," Ryan replied carefully. "What exactly are you suggesting, Jake?" Jake's smile widened, and he gestured toward the room full of officers and their companions, mostly young, attractive women who gravitated toward the power and prestige of military command. "Look around, Ryan. Your usual type. Models, socialites, women who see a uniform and dollar signs. You've never had to work for it, never had to earn someone's respect or affection." Ryan bristled slightly at the characterization, though he couldn't entirely dispute it. His romantic history was indeed filled with women who were drawn to his rank, his success, and the lifestyle that came with both. But he'd never seen that as a weakness. It was simply another area where his achievements opened doors. "Get to the point, Mitchell." Jake's expression grew more serious, though the mischievous spark remained in his eyes. "I'm talking about a real challenge, Torres. Something that would test not just your tactical skills, but your character, your ability to see beyond the surface and find value where others might not look." The conversation was interrupted by a burst of laughter from across the room, where several junior officers were recounting war stories from the recent exercise. Ryan used the moment to study Jake more carefully, trying to anticipate where this was leading. In all their years of friendship, Jake had never been one to back down from a challenge or to issue one lightly. "All right," Ryan said finally. "I'll bite. What kind of challenge are we talking about?" Jake leaned back, satisfied that he had Ryan's full attention. "Marriage." "Marriage?" Ryan nearly choked on his whiskey. You want me to get married as part of some kind of bet? Not just any marriage, Jake clarified, his voice taking on the tone of a briefing officer outlining a complex mission. I'm talking about marrying someone who doesn't fit your usual parameters, someone who would force you to look beyond surface appearances and discover what real partnership means. Ryan felt a cold knot forming in his stomach, though his expression remained carefully neutral. This wasn't the kind of challenge he had expected, and something about Jake's intensity suggested this wasn't just another alcohol-fueled dare between old friends. And what would be the objective of this mission? Ryan asked, using military terminology to maintain some distance from the personal implications. Simple, Jake replied, raising his glass again. Prove that the great Ryan Torres can succeed at something that can't be won through tactical superiority or commanding presence. Prove you can earn someone's love and respect through character alone. The room seemed to fade around them as Ryan processed the implications of what Jake was suggesting. Marriage had always been something he'd planned to approach strategically, finding the right partner to complement his career goals, someone who would enhance his standing in the military community. The idea of entering into marriage as a test of character rather than a calculated alliance was foreign territory. And if I were to accept this hypothetical challenge, Ryan said slowly, what would be the terms of engagement? Jake's smile turned predatory. $100,000. The figure hit Ryan like a physical blow. $100,000 was more than 2 years' base pay, enough to secure his financial future or invest in the post-military career he'd been contemplating. But more than the money, the sheer audacity of the wager spoke to something deeper. Jake's belief that Ryan couldn't succeed at something that couldn't be controlled through conventional means. 100,000, Ryan repeated, his mind already calculating the implications. And the target parameters? Lieutenant Sarah Chen, Jake said without hesitation. Recently transferred to our base from the Atlantic Fleet. 8 years of service, stellar professional record, but... He paused, choosing his words carefully. Let's just say she doesn't fit the typical mold of women you've pursued in the past. Ryan's tactical mind immediately began gathering intelligence. He knew the name vaguely. Chen had been mentioned in the transfer briefings as a communications specialist with experience in joint operations. But he couldn't place a face with the name, which meant she hadn't made the kind of impression that would catch his attention under normal circumstances. What's the full mission scope? Ryan asked, his competitive instincts fully engaged now despite his reservations. Jake leaned forward, his voice dropping to ensure their conversation remained private. Marriage, minimum 6 months duration. But here's the real challenge. She has to pass advanced combat training under your direct supervision. And, he added with particular emphasis, you have to earn her genuine affection, not compliance, not resignation, real love. The additional parameters transformed the challenge from a simple endurance test into something far more complex. Ryan had supervised countless training exercises, pushed subordinates to their limits and beyond. But doing so while simultaneously building a romantic relationship introduced variables he had never had to consider. And how exactly would success be measured? Ryan asked, though part of him was already committed to accepting regardless of the answer. Simple, Jake replied. At the end of 6 months, if you're genuinely happy together and she chooses to stay married without any external pressure, you win. If she walks away, or if it's clear the relationship is based on anything other than mutual love and respect, I win. Ryan stood silent for a long moment, weighing the challenge against his own capabilities. Every instinct told him this was different from any mission he'd undertaken before, but that only made it more appealing. He had built his career on succeeding where others failed, on taking on challenges that others considered impossible. What makes you think I'll accept this? Ryan asked, though they both knew he was merely negotiating the final terms rather than declining. Jake's expression grew serious, almost contemplative. Because despite all your success, despite all your achievements, you've never actually been tested where it matters most. You've never had to prove your worth loving for who you are rather than what you've accomplished. The words cut deeper than Ryan cared to admit. Throughout his career, he had surrounded himself with people who respected his rank, his achievements, his ability to deliver results. But Jake was suggesting that beneath all the external markers of success, there was a fundamental question about his character that had never been answered. And you think Lieutenant Chen represents that kind of test? I think, Jake said carefully, that Sarah Chen is the kind of woman who sees through military bearing and career achievements to the person underneath. She's not impressed by rank or wealth or social status. If you can earn her love, it'll be because she sees something in you that has nothing to do with your uniform. Ryan felt a familiar stirring, the same sensation he experienced before every major operation or difficult mission. It was a mixture of anticipation, determination, and the absolute confidence that he could overcome any obstacle through superior planning and execution. "Timeline for decision?" he asked. "No rush," Jake replied with a grin. "But I should mention, she's been invited to tomorrow night's squadron social. Excellent opportunity for initial reconnaissance." Ryan drained his whiskey glass in one smooth motion, feeling the burn of alcohol and adrenaline mixing in his system. Every rational part of his mind recognized that this was potentially the most dangerous mission he'd ever undertaken, not to his physical safety, but to the carefully constructed identity he'd built over 15 years of military service. But the competitive fire that had driven him to excel at every level of his career was already blazing. The idea that there was something he couldn't accomplish, some challenge he couldn't master through determination and strategic thinking, was unacceptable. "All right, Mitchell," Ryan said, extending his hand. "You have yourself a bet." Jake's grip was firm as they shook hands, sealing an agreement that would change both their lives in ways neither could anticipate. May the best man win, Torres. As Ryan left the officers' club that night, walking through the warm San Diego evening toward his quarters, he found himself analyzing the challenge ahead with the same methodical approach he brought to every military operation. He would research Lieutenant Chen thoroughly, develop a comprehensive strategy for their initial meeting, and approach the relationship with the same tactical precision that had made him successful in every other area of his life. What Ryan didn't yet understand was that some battles couldn't be won through superior firepower or strategic positioning. Some victories required a different kind of courage altogether, the courage to be vulnerable, to admit weakness, and to value someone else's needs above his own ambitions. The real test was about to begin. 3 days later, Ryan stood in his office reviewing personnel files with the same intensity he brought to pre-mission intelligence gathering. Sarah Chen's service record was spread across his desk like a tactical map, each detail carefully analyzed and cross-referenced with additional information he'd gathered through unofficial channels. The professional picture that emerged was impressive by any standard. 8 years of distinguished service, multiple commendations for technical excellence, and a reputation for calm performance under pressure that had earned her assignments to some of the fleet's most demanding operations. She had served aboard 3 different vessels, participated in humanitarian missions in Southeast Asia, and earned the respect of commanding officers who were notoriously difficult to impress. But it was the personal details that intrigued Ryan most. Unlike many career military personnel, Sarah had maintained strong connections to civilian life. She held a master's degree in electrical engineering earned through night school and correspondence courses, regularly sent money to support elderly parents in California, and had turned down multiple opportunities for advancement that would have required extensive travel away from family obligations. The photograph in her file showed a woman with intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense expression that suggested someone accustomed to being taken seriously in professional settings. Ryan studied the image carefully, trying to reconcile Jake's description of her as being outside his usual type with what appeared to be a competent, accomplished officer. His research was interrupted by a knock on his office door. "Enter," he called, quickly closing the personnel file. Petty Officer Rodriguez stepped inside and came to attention. "Sir, Lieutenant Chen has arrived for her orientation briefing." Ryan felt an unexpected surge of nervous energy, the same sensation he experienced before leading his first boarding party or taking command of his first vessel. "Send her in, Rodriguez." The woman who entered his office was not what Ryan had expected based on her personnel file and Jake's cryptic comments. Lieutenant Sarah Chen was indeed larger than the women Ryan typically associated with, but she carried herself with the bearing of someone absolutely comfortable in her own skin. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, her posture impeccable, and her direct gaze suggested someone who had long ago stopped worrying about other people's opinions. "Lieutenant Chen reporting as ordered, sir," she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to command situations. Ryan stood and extended his hand, noting that her grip was firm and confident. "Welcome to the base, Lieutenant. I'm Commander Torres, your new department head." "Thank you, sir. I'm looking forward to working with the communications team here." There was something about her directness that immediately set her apart from most personnel interactions Ryan experienced. Most junior officers displayed at least some nervous energy when meeting a new commanding officer, but Sarah seemed completely at ease, as if she were evaluating him rather than the other way around. "I've reviewed your service record," Ryan said, gesturing for her to take a seat. "Impressive background. The Atlantic Fleet's loss is our gain." Sarah's expression remained professionally neutral, though Ryan detected a slight tightening around her eyes. "I appreciate the confidence, sir. I hope to maintain the same standards of performance here." Ryan found himself studying her more carefully, trying to understand what Jake had seen that made her such an interesting challenge. There was an intelligence in her manner that suggested someone who thought several moves ahead and a calmness that implied she was rarely caught off guard by unexpected situations. "Tell me about your experience with joint operations," Ryan said, settling into what he intended to be a routine orientation discussion while simultaneously gathering tactical intelligence for his personal mission. For the next 20 minutes, Sarah provided detailed accounts of complex operations she had supported, demonstrating not just technical competence, but strategic thinking that impressed Ryan despite his intention to remain analytically detached. She spoke about coordinating communications during a humanitarian mission in the Philippines with the same precision she described maintaining radar systems during a live-fire exercise in the Mediterranean. What struck Ryan most was her complete lack of deference beyond what military protocol required. She answered his questions thoroughly and professionally, but without the eager-to-please attitude he had grown accustomed to from subordinates who saw interaction with superior officers as career advancement opportunities. "One final question, Lieutenant," Ryan said as the briefing concluded. "I understand you've been invited to tomorrow night's squadron social. Will you be attending?" Sarah's expression shifted slightly, the first sign of uncertainty she had displayed during their meeting. "I hadn't planned on it, sir. Social events aren't really my priority." "I'd encourage you to reconsider," Ryan said, careful to keep his tone professionally neutral. "These gatherings are valuable for building relationships within the unit. Team cohesion often develops as much outside formal duty hours as during." Sarah studied him for a moment, and Ryan had the uncomfortable sensation that she was analyzing his motivations with the same tactical precision he had been applying to her. "If you think it would be beneficial for unit integration, sir, I'll make an appearance." "Excellent. Dismissed, Lieutenant." After Sarah left his office, Ryan sat back in his chair and tried to process what had just occurred. The interaction had been entirely professional and appropriate, but something about her manner suggested she had been conducting her own assessment of him. For the first time in years, Ryan felt like he had been the one being evaluated, rather than doing the evaluating. That evening, Ryan found himself doing something he hadn't done since his academy days, actually planning what to wear to a social event. He stood before his closet, analyzing his civilian wardrobe with the same attention to detail he brought to selecting equipment for a mission. Every choice had to support his operational objectives while appearing completely natural. The squadron social was being held at the Coronado Beach Club, a popular venue for military events that offered spectacular views of the Pacific and enough space for the informal mixing that made these gatherings valuable for building unit cohesion. Ryan arrived fashionably late, allowing him to survey the tactical situation before committing to any particular approach. The usual crowd was present. Junior officers clustered around the bar-building camaraderie, senior staff maintaining professional networks through carefully managed conversations, and the accompanying civilians who gravitated toward military social events for various personal and professional reasons. Ryan spotted Sarah almost immediately, despite the crowd. She stood near the windows overlooking the ocean, wearing a simple but elegant dress that somehow managed to be both flattering and entirely appropriate for the professional setting. What caught his attention most, however, was her obvious discomfort with the social dynamics playing out around her. Unlike the other attendees who moved through the crowd with practiced ease, Sarah remained in position near the windows, politely deflecting attempts at conversation while maintaining the kind of alert posture that suggested she was ready to execute a tactical withdrawal at the first opportunity. Ryan approached carefully, timing his movement to appear casual rather than targeted. "Lieutenant Chen," he said as he moved to stand beside her at the windows. "I'm glad you decided to attend." Sarah turned toward him, and Ryan noticed she seemed genuinely relieved to see a familiar face. "Commander Torres, thank you for the encouragement to come, though I have to admit this isn't exactly my natural environment." "What would be your natural environment?" Ryan asked, genuinely curious despite his tactical objectives. Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering her response. "Honestly, probably a workshop somewhere, taking apart electronics to figure out how they work. Or maybe a library, researching new developments in satellite communications. Not particularly exciting by most people's standards." Ryan found himself surprisingly interested in her answer. Most of the women at these events spoke about fashion, travel, or social activities, pursuits that were perfectly valid but rarely offered insight into how someone actually thought about the world. "What got you interested in communication systems?" he asked. "My father was an electrician," Sarah replied, her expression softening slightly. "When I was young, he used to bring home broken radios and televisions that people had thrown away. We'd spend weekends figuring out what was wrong and how to fix them. I loved the puzzle aspect, tracing signals through circuits, understanding how all the pieces worked together to create something functional." Ryan noticed that this was the first time during their interactions that Sarah had volunteered personal information rather than simply responding to direct questions. He filed the observation away while maintaining the conversation. "That's quite a foundation for a military communications career." "It prepared me for the technical aspects," Sarah agreed. "But the military side taught me something equally important: how to stay calm when systems fail at the worst possible moment. There's nothing quite like troubleshooting satellite links while under fire to teach you about pressure management." Ryan felt a spark of genuine respect at her matter-of-fact reference to combat experience. It was easy to forget, surrounded by the social atmosphere of the event, that many of the people in this room had faced life-and-death situations where technical competence could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "You've seen action?" he asked. Sarah's expression grew more serious. 3 deployments, 2 in the Gulf, 1 in the Western Pacific. Nothing as dramatic as destroyer command, but enough to understand that when the shooting starts, the only thing that matters is whether you can do your job. Ryan found himself reassessing his initial tactical approach. He had planned to charm Sarah through a combination of professional respect and personal attention, the same strategy that had proven effective with previous romantic interests. But Sarah's obvious competence and combat experience suggested someone who would see through superficial approaches immediately. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Commander Jake Mitchell, who appeared at Ryan's shoulder with the timing of someone who had been monitoring the situation from across the room. "Torres, I see you've met our newest communications specialist," Jake said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Lieutenant Chen, how are you finding San Diego so far?" "Still getting oriented, sir," Sarah replied politely, "but it seems like an excellent assignment." "Ryan here was just telling me the other day how important it is to have top-tier communication support for the training exercises we have planned," Jake continued, and Ryan realized his friend was providing tactical support for his mission, especially the advanced combat simulations coming up next month. Sarah's attention sharpened immediately. "Advanced combat simulations, sir?" Ryan seized the opening, recognizing an opportunity to transition from social conversation to professional discussion, terrain where he was completely confident. "Multi-platform exercises designed to test coordination between surface vessels, aircraft, and shore-based assets under combat conditions. The communications requirements are extremely demanding." "What kind of platforms are we talking about?" Sarah asked, her earlier discomfort with the social setting completely forgotten in the face of professional interest. For the next 30 minutes, Ryan found himself engaged in the most intellectually stimulating conversation he'd had in months. Sarah's questions demonstrated not just technical knowledge, but strategic thinking about how communication systems supported overall mission objectives. She understood the interconnections between different military specialties in ways that many career officers never grasped. More importantly, Ryan realized that his own interest in the conversation was genuine rather than purely tactical. Sarah's perspective on operational challenges was refreshing, unfiltered by the political considerations that often influence discussions at his command level. "I should probably let you get back to the social aspects of the evening," Sarah said eventually, glancing around the room at the other conversations taking place. "I don't want to monopolize your time." "Actually," Ryan said, making a decision that surprised him with its spontaneity, "would you like to continue this conversation somewhere quieter? There's a coffee shop just down the beach that stays open late." Sarah studied his face for a moment, and Ryan had the distinct impression she was trying to read his motivations. "Are you asking me as my commanding officer who thinks continued professional discussion would be beneficial, or as—" She paused, seeming to search for the right words. "As someone who would like to get to know you better," Ryan said, recognizing that anything less than complete honesty would be immediately detected and rejected. Sarah's expression remained thoughtful, but Ryan caught a slight smile at the corners of her mouth. "In that case, Commander Torres, I think I'd like that." As they left the beach club together, Ryan felt a mixture of satisfaction and uncertainty that was entirely new to his experience. Phase 1 of his mission had been successfully completed. He had established initial contact and secured agreement for extended interaction. But something about Sarah's direct manner and obvious intelligence suggested that the challenges ahead would be unlike anything he had previously encountered. Walking along the moonlit beach toward the coffee shop, Ryan found himself wondering for the first time whether winning this bet would prove to be as straightforward as he had initially calculated. The coffee shop Sarah and Ryan found themselves in was a small, intimate place popular with locals rather than military personnel. Exactly the kind of environment where real conversation could develop without the formal constraints of base interactions. Ryan chose a corner table that offered privacy while allowing him to observe Sarah's reactions without the scrutiny that came with his rank. "I have to ask," Sarah said once they were settled with their coffee. "Is this standard procedure for you? Taking new personnel out for late-night coffee discussions?" Ryan felt a moment of panic, wondering if his intentions were more transparent than he had intended. But Sarah's expression suggested curiosity rather than suspicion, so he decided to respond with partial honesty. "No," he admitted. "But most new personnel don't demonstrate your level of strategic thinking during casual conversation. I found myself genuinely interested in your perspective on operational challenges." Sarah wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, a gesture that suggested she was considering how much of herself to reveal. "Can I be direct with you, Commander? Please. I've been in the military long enough to recognize when someone is evaluating me for something beyond standard professional purposes," she said, her tone remaining friendly but gaining an edge of seriousness. "I'm not naive about the attention that comes with being one of the few women in many technical specialties, and I've learned to be cautious about situations that might be more complicated than they initially appear." Ryan felt a cold sensation in his stomach, realizing that his tactical approach might have been more obvious than he intended. But before he could respond, Sarah continued. "However," she said, "I'm also experienced enough to distinguish between predatory interest and genuine respect. Our conversation tonight felt like the latter, which is why I agreed to come here." Ryan found himself in unfamiliar territory. Most of his previous romantic interactions had followed predictable patterns where his rank and success created inherent advantages. But Sarah was clearly operating from a position of strength, establishing boundaries and expectations from the beginning. "I appreciate your directness," Ryan said carefully, "and you're right to be cautious. But I can honestly say that my interest in continuing our conversation is based on finding someone who thinks about operational challenges in ways I hadn't considered." Sarah studied his face for several moments, and Ryan had the uncomfortable sensation of being thoroughly analyzed. Finally, she seemed to reach some internal conclusion. "All right," she said, "but I want to establish some ground rules if we're going to develop any kind of relationship beyond professional necessity." Ryan felt his competitive instincts engaging. He was accustomed to setting terms rather than having them dictated to him, but something about Sarah's manner suggested that attempting to assert control would be counterproductive. "What kind of ground rules?" "First," Sarah said, "I'm not interested in being someone's trophy or accessory. I have my own career goals and personal interests that won't be subordinated to anyone else's agenda." Ryan nodded, though he mentally noted that this condition might complicate certain aspects of his strategic objectives. "Second," Sarah continued, "I don't play games. If you're interested in getting to know me, it needs to be because you actually want to get to know me, not because I represent some kind of challenge or conquest." This condition struck closer to home, and Ryan felt a moment of guilt about the nature of his actual motivations. But he rationalized that getting to know Sarah was indeed part of his mission, even if his ultimate objectives were more complex than she realized. "Third," Sarah said, her expression growing more serious, "I have very little patience for dishonesty or manipulation. I've dealt with enough men who thought they could manage me through charm or authority to recognize the signs immediately." Ryan felt genuinely uncomfortable now, realizing that Sarah's conditions were directly addressing behaviors that formed the core of his planned approach. But rather than retreat, he found himself curious about what kind of relationship might develop if he actually followed her guidelines. "Those all seem like reasonable conditions," he said finally, "but I have a question for you." "Which is?" "What made you willing to give me the benefit of the doubt? Based on what you've said, you've obviously dealt with situations where men weren't approaching you with entirely honest intentions." Sarah smiled for the first time that evening, a genuine expression that transformed her entire appearance. "Because despite your obvious confidence and success, you actually listened to what I said during our professional conversation. Most men in your position would have been waiting for their turn to talk rather than processing the content of my responses." Ryan felt an unexpected surge of pride at her assessment, followed immediately by guilt at his deception. Sarah had identified something in his behavior that she valued, but she was attributing it to character traits rather than tactical training. Besides, Sarah added with a slight grin, I heard about the bet. Ryan's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth, and he felt the blood drain from his face. What bet? Sarah's expression remained amused, but gained a sharp edge that reminded Ryan she was a military intelligence specialist, trained to gather and analyze information. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell isn't as discreet as he thinks he is. Something about marrying someone who doesn't fit your usual type and proving you can earn genuine affection rather than compliance. Ryan set down his coffee cup carefully, his mind racing through possible responses. Complete denial was clearly impossible since Sarah obviously had specific information. Partial truth might be manageable, but he suspected Sarah would see through any attempt at misdirection. How much do you know? He asked finally. Enough, Sarah said, leaning back in her chair with an expression of calm satisfaction. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Ryan felt like he was drowning, watching his carefully planned mission collapse before it had properly begun. Every instinct told him to retreat, to abort the operation and accept the financial loss rather than face the humiliation of exposure. But something about Sarah's manner suggested she wasn't preparing to destroy him. There was challenge in her expression, but also curiosity, as if she were waiting to see how he would respond when his tactical advantage was eliminated. What would you like me to do about it? Ryan asked, recognizing that he was essentially surrendering the initiative but seeing no viable alternative. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, appearing to consider her options. When she finally spoke, her tone was thoughtful rather than accusatory. I want you to tell me why you accepted the bet. The question caught Ryan off guard. He had expected anger, demands for apologies, or immediate termination of their interaction. Instead, Sarah seemed genuinely interested in understanding his motivations. Honestly, Ryan said, deciding that complete honesty was his only remaining option. Because I've never encountered a challenge I couldn't master through proper planning and execution. Jake made it sound like you represented something I couldn't win through conventional means. And that appealed to you? Everything appeals to me if it's difficult enough, Ryan admitted. I've built my entire career on succeeding where others failed. Sarah nodded slowly, as if his answer confirmed something she had already suspected. And what did you learn about me during your research that made you think this would be possible? Ryan felt heat rising in his cheeks as he realized how his intelligence gathering would sound when described aloud. Your service record, your professional reputation, some personal background about your family and education. In other words, you approach this like a military operation, gathering intelligence on a target and developing a strategy for achieving your objectives. Yes, Ryan said, recognizing that any attempt to soften the description would only make things worse. Sarah laughed, a sound that was genuinely amused rather than bitter. Do you have any idea how refreshing that is? Ryan stared at her, completely confused by her reaction. Refreshing? Most men who approach me either pretend my career and intelligence don't exist, or they're intimidated by them, Sarah explained. You're the first person who treated them as relevant factors worthy of serious analysis. Ryan felt like the conversation had taken a turn into completely unfamiliar territory. You're not angry about the bet? Oh, I'm furious about the bet, Sarah said, her expression hardening slightly. The idea that my worth as a person could be reduced to someone's entertainment is insulting beyond description. Ryan braced himself for the verbal assault he now realized he deserved. However, Sarah continued, I'm also intrigued by the opportunity it presents. What opportunity? Sarah leaned forward, her expression taking on the same intensity Ryan had observed during their professional discussion. The opportunity to turn the tables. Ryan felt a chill of apprehension, recognizing the look of someone who had just identified a tactical advantage. What do you mean? Simple, Sarah said with a smile that was both warm and predatory. You want to win a bet by earning my genuine affection. I want to find out if the great Commander Torres is capable of actually caring about someone other than himself. Ryan processed her words, trying to understand the strategic situation he now found himself in. So you're proposing a counter-operation, Sarah said. You try to make me fall in love with you, and I'll evaluate whether you're worth falling in love with. If you succeed, you win your bet, and I get to decide whether I want to stay with someone who's proven himself worthy of respect. If you fail, you lose your money, and I get the satisfaction of knowing I can't be manipulated. Ryan stared at her, realizing that what had begun as his tactical operation had somehow been transformed into something far more dangerous. Sarah wasn't just agreeing to be the target of his mission, she was proposing to make him the target of hers. And you think this could actually work? He asked. I think, Sarah said, standing up and extending her hand, that we're about to find out. As Ryan shook her hand, sealing an agreement he didn't fully understand, he wondered if he had just made the greatest tactical error of his career or taken the first step toward something entirely new. The next 6 weeks at Naval Base San Diego took on a rhythm unlike anything Ryan had experienced in his 15-year military career. What had begun as a calculated mission to win a bet had evolved into something far more complex, a careful dance between two intelligent people trying to understand each other while simultaneously pursuing their own strategic objectives. Ryan found himself looking forward to his interactions with Sarah with an anticipation that went beyond tactical planning. Their daily professional briefings had expanded into longer conversations about operational theory, military history, and the technical challenges facing modern naval communications. Sarah's insights consistently surprised him, offering perspectives that forced him to reconsider assumptions he had held for years. More unsettling was his growing awareness that Sarah was conducting her own thorough evaluation of his character, motivations, and potential for growth. She had a way of asking questions that seemed casual, but were clearly designed to reveal how he thought about leadership, responsibility, and relationships with subordinates. Tell me about your most difficult command decision, Sarah had asked during one of their coffee meetings that had become a regular occurrence. Ryan had shared the story of a rescue operation in the Persian Gulf where he had been forced to choose between attempting to save a crew member who was probably already dead and preserving the safety of his entire ship. It was a decision that still haunted him, but Sarah's response had been unexpected. How do you live with decisions like that? She had asked, not with sympathy, but with genuine curiosity about his psychological processes. You learn to separate personal emotions from operational necessities, Ryan had replied, giving her the standard answer he used when discussing command challenges. Sarah had studied his face for a long moment before responding. That's what you tell yourself. But what do you actually feel when you remember that moment? The question had caught Ryan completely off guard. No one had ever asked him about the emotional reality of command decisions, and he found himself struggling to articulate feelings he had spent years learning to suppress. Guilty, he had admitted finally. Even though I know it was the right tactical decision. I still feel guilty about not trying harder to save him. Sarah had nodded as if his answer confirmed something important. Good, she had said. If you didn't feel guilty, it would mean you'd lost the ability to value individual lives. It was conversations like these that made Ryan realize Sarah's evaluation of him was more sophisticated than he had initially understood. She wasn't just testing whether he could be charming or attentive, she was assessing his fundamental character and capacity for emotional growth. Meanwhile, Ryan was discovering that his initial attraction to Sarah had been based on a serious underestimation of her complexity. Beyond her obvious professional competence and intellectual capabilities, she possessed an emotional intelligence that allowed her to read people and situations with remarkable accuracy. Their relationship had also begun to attract attention from other personnel on the base. Ryan was accustomed to his romantic interests being the subject of casual speculation among his fellow officers, but Sarah's presence in his life seemed to generate a different kind of discussion. Where his previous relationships had been seen as predictable choices that enhanced his social status, his growing connection with Sarah was viewed as unexpected and intriguing. "Torres, I have to admit I didn't see this coming," Admiral Patterson had mentioned during a routine briefing, his tone carrying the casual interest of someone who had known Ryan throughout his career. "Lieutenant Chen has quite a reputation for brilliance. Not exactly your usual type, but impressive in her own right." Ryan had felt an unexpected surge of protective instincts at the backhanded compliment, realizing that other people's casual assessments of Sarah bothered him far more than he had anticipated. The discovery that he genuinely cared about how others viewed her was unsettling, suggesting that his feelings were developing beyond the tactical parameters he had originally established. The real test of their evolving relationship came during the advanced combat training exercise that had been scheduled for late autumn. Sarah had requested participation in the simulation, arguing that communications personnel needed direct experience with combat conditions to provide optimal support during real operations. Ryan had initially resisted the idea, using standard safety protocols as justification for keeping Sarah in a support role rather than direct participation. But Sarah had challenged his decision during a private meeting in his office, and the conversation had revealed underlying tensions that both of them had been avoiding. "Is this about my capabilities as an officer, or about your discomfort with me being in potential danger?" Sarah had asked, her tone remaining professional but carrying an edge that suggested she already knew the answer. Ryan had found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to examine his own motivations. The rational part of his mind recognized that Sarah was absolutely qualified for the exercise and that her request was professionally appropriate, but something deeper, something he wasn't entirely comfortable acknowledging, made the idea of her being in harm's way unacceptable. "The exercise involves live ammunition and realistic combat scenarios," Ryan had replied, attempting to maintain professional justification for his position. "Personnel with limited combat experience are typically kept in support roles." Sarah had pulled out her service record and placed it on his desk with the precision of someone presenting evidence in a court-martial. 3 combat deployments, 2 commendations for performance under fire, and qualification scores that exceed base requirements for all standard infantry weapons. "What part of my experience qualifies as limited?" Ryan had stared at the documentation, realizing that his objections had nothing to do with Sarah's qualifications and everything to do with his growing emotional investment in her safety. It was a revelation that forced him to confront how dramatically his perspective on their relationship had changed. "You're right," he had admitted. "Your request is approved." But Sarah hadn't been satisfied with simple approval. "I want to understand why you initially resisted," she had said, her expression serious. "Because if this relationship is going to work, I need to know that you can separate your personal feelings from your professional judgment." The directness of her challenge had caught Ryan off guard. Most people in his life accepted his decisions without demanding explanations of his underlying motivations. But Sarah consistently refused to allow him the luxury of operating without accountability. "Because," Ryan had said, making a decision to be completely honest, "the idea of you being in danger makes me feel things I'm not accustomed to dealing with." Sarah had studied his face for a long moment, and Ryan had the impression that his answer was being weighed against some internal standard she had established for evaluating his character. "Good," she had said finally. "That means you're starting to understand what it feels like to care about someone other than yourself." The combat exercise had taken place 3 weeks later across a series of training areas designed to simulate hostile territory. Sarah had been assigned to Ryan's unit as the primary communications specialist, a role that required her to maintain contact with command while moving through challenging terrain under simulated enemy fire. Ryan had watched her performance with a mixture of pride and anxiety that was entirely new to his experience. Sarah moved through the exercise with the calm efficiency of someone completely comfortable in combat situations, coordinating communications while simultaneously providing covering fire for other team members when necessary. During one particularly intense phase of the simulation, their unit had come under heavy enemy fire that required rapid tactical decisions about retreat versus advance. Sarah had maintained communications with 3 different support elements while providing tactical analysis that influenced Ryan's command decisions. "Commander, we have artillery support available in Grid Square 77 Alpha, but it's danger close to friendly positions in 68 Bravo," she had reported while taking cover behind a concrete barrier. "Recommend we advance 50 meters northeast before calling in fire support." Ryan had followed her recommendation, and the subsequent tactical success had been largely due to her accurate assessment of the battlefield situation. Watching her perform at that level while under pressure had given Ryan a new appreciation for her capabilities that went far beyond their personal relationship. But it was after the exercise during the debrief session that Ryan realized how fundamentally Sarah had changed his perspective on leadership and relationships. "Excellent performance, Lieutenant Chen," Colonel Morrison had said during the formal assessment. "Your coordination between multiple support elements was textbook quality." Sarah had accepted the praise professionally, but Ryan had noticed her glance toward him as if seeking his approval as well. The realization that his opinion mattered to her had hit him with unexpected force, making him understand that her feelings for him were developing beyond the tactical evaluation she had originally described. That evening, they had walked along the beach near the base, both still processing the intensity of the day's exercise. The conversation had been quieter than usual, as if they were both recognizing that something significant had shifted in their relationship. "I need to tell you something," Sarah had said as they stopped to watch the sunset over the Pacific. "When I first agreed to this arrangement, I thought I was conducting an objective evaluation of your character." Ryan had felt a cold sensation in his stomach, wondering if she was about to announce that he had failed whatever test she had been administering. "But," Sarah had continued, "somewhere during these past few weeks, I stopped evaluating and started caring. That changes everything." Ryan had stared at her, realizing that she was describing exactly what had happened to him as well. What had begun as a tactical mission had transformed into something genuine and emotionally complex. "For me too," he had admitted. "I've never been in a relationship where the other person actually challenged me to be better than I was." Sarah had smiled, the first completely unguarded expression he had seen from her. "So, what do we do now?" Ryan had considered the question, recognizing that they had reached a decision point that would determine the future of their relationship. The original bet with Jake seemed almost irrelevant now, overshadowed by the reality of their developing connection. "I think," Ryan had said, "we stop treating this like a military operation and start treating it like what it actually is." "Which is?" "Two people who are falling in love and trying to figure out how to make that work." Sarah had laughed, a sound of genuine happiness that Ryan realized he wanted to hear for the rest of his life. "I can work with those parameters." The conversation had been interrupted by Ryan's communication device, indicating an urgent message from base operations. Emergency situations were common enough in military life that both of them immediately shifted into professional mode. "Commander Torres, report to operations immediately for priority briefing," the message read. "Lieutenant Chen to accompany." They had returned to base quickly, both speculating about what kind of situation would require immediate attention from both a destroyer commander and a communication specialist. The operations center had been buzzing with activity when they arrived, suggesting something significant was developing. Captain Rodriguez, the base operations officer, had briefed them on a developing situation in the Western Pacific where a civilian cargo vessel had suffered catastrophic engine failure in international waters during a severe storm. The ship was carrying medical supplies for humanitarian operations, and its crew of 12 was in immediate danger. Weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly, Captain Rodriguez had explained. Coast Guard assets are at maximum range, and we have the closest available naval resources. Ryan had immediately understood the operational parameters. His destroyer was the most capable rescue platform available, but the weather conditions and distance would make the mission extremely dangerous. "What's the timeline?" Ryan had asked. 6 hours before weather conditions become too severe for safe rescue operations, Rodriguez had replied. After that, we're looking at a potential loss of all hands. Ryan had glanced at Sarah, recognizing that her communications expertise would be crucial for coordinating a complex rescue operation in deteriorating conditions. But he had also realized that deploying on this mission would mean putting her in genuine danger, rather than the simulated threats of training exercises. "Lieutenant Chen," Ryan had said formally, "this mission will involve significant risk to all personnel. Participation is voluntary for non-essential specialists." Sarah had met his gaze directly, and Ryan had seen understanding of both the operational requirements and his personal concerns reflected in her expression. "Sir," she had replied with crisp military precision, "communications coordination will be essential for mission success. I request permission to deploy with the rescue team." Ryan had felt the same protective instincts that had surfaced during the training exercise, but magnified by the reality that this time the danger would be genuine. Every rational part of his mind recognized that Sarah's participation was not only appropriate but probably necessary for mission success. But the emotional part of his mind recoiled at the idea of her facing actual life-threatening situations. "Permission granted," he had said, making the decision that duty required while simultaneously hating every aspect of it. The next 12 hours had been the most challenging of Ryan's military career, and not because of the technical difficulties of the rescue operation. Working alongside Sarah in genuine crisis conditions had forced him to confront how dramatically his priorities had shifted over the past few months. The storm they encountered during the rescue had been worse than predicted, with 30-foot swells and winds exceeding 50 knots. Ryan's destroyer had been pushed to its operational limits just reaching the distressed vessel, and coordinating the actual rescue had required precise communication between multiple platforms operating in extremely dangerous conditions. Sarah had performed flawlessly throughout the operation, maintaining contact with Coast Guard helicopters, coordinating with medical teams, and providing tactical communications that enabled them to successfully evacuate all 12 crew members from the cargo ship before it was destroyed by the storm. But it was during the return journey to base that Ryan had experienced what he would later recognize as a fundamental transformation in his understanding of love and commitment. Sarah had been working continuously for 18 hours, managing communications while fighting seasickness caused by the destroyer's violent motion through heavy seas. Ryan had found her in the communications center during a brief calm period, slumped over her equipment in exhaustion. "Lieutenant," he had said quietly, "you need to get some rest." Sarah had looked up at him with eyes that were bloodshot from fatigue and strain. "Can't, sir. Need to maintain contact with medical teams until we reach port." Ryan had stared at her dedication and professionalism, realizing that she was pushing herself beyond reasonable limits not for personal glory or career advancement, but because lives depended on her performance. It was a level of selfless commitment that put his own motivations in perspective. "I'll take over communications," Ryan had said. "Get some sleep." Sarah had started to protest, but Ryan had gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "That's an order, Lieutenant." As Sarah had finally allowed herself to rest, Ryan had taken over the communications responsibilities and found himself thinking about the extraordinary woman who had somehow transformed his understanding of duty, sacrifice, and love. The successful completion of the rescue mission had earned commendations for the entire crew, with specific recognition for Sarah's communications coordination under extreme conditions. But for Ryan, the real significance of the operation had been the realization that his feelings for Sarah had evolved far beyond anything he had previously experienced. 2 days later, they had met for coffee at their usual location, both still processing the intensity of their first real combat operation together. The conversation had been subdued initially, as if they were both recognizing that their relationship had crossed into territory that neither had fully anticipated. "I need to ask you something," Sarah had said, her expression serious. "And I need you to be completely honest with me." Ryan had braced himself, wondering if she was about to confront him about his obvious concern for her safety during the mission. "During the rescue operation," Sarah had continued, "I watched you make decisions that put mission success ahead of personal considerations, even when it meant putting people you cared about in danger." Ryan had nodded, uncertain where she was heading with her observation. "That's the kind of character I was hoping to find," Sarah had said softly. "Someone who could balance personal feelings with professional responsibilities. Someone who understood that caring about people sometimes means letting them do dangerous things because it's the right thing to do." Ryan had felt a surge of relief and pride at her assessment, but also a growing awareness that Sarah's evaluation process had been more sophisticated than he had realized. "But I also need to know," Sarah had continued, "whether your feelings for me are genuine or whether I'm still just a challenge you're trying to master." The question had forced Ryan to examine his own motivations with painful honesty. Over the past few months, his initial tactical approach to their relationship had gradually been replaced by genuine emotional investment, but the transition had been so gradual that he hadn't fully recognized when it occurred. "When I accepted Jake's bet," Ryan had said slowly, "I thought I was taking on a challenge that I could win through superior planning and execution. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being about winning anything and started being about discovering who I could become with the right person." Sarah had studied his face intently, and Ryan had the impression that his answer was being measured against standards that would determine the future of their relationship. "And who have you become?" she had asked. Ryan had considered the question, recognizing that his perspective on leadership, relationships, and personal priorities had undergone fundamental changes since meeting Sarah. "Someone who cares more about earning your respect than impressing other people," he had replied. "Someone who understands that real strength comes from admitting weakness and growing from it." Sarah had smiled then, the kind of expression that suggested she had found what she was looking for. "In that case," she had said, "I think it's time we made this relationship official." Ryan had stared at her, not entirely certain what she meant. "Official?" "I mean," Sarah had said, reaching across the table to take his hand, "that I'm ready to stop evaluating you and start building something together. If you're interested." Ryan had felt a surge of emotion that was entirely new to his experience. Not the satisfaction of winning a competition, but the deep contentment that came from being valued by someone whose opinion truly mattered. "I'm interested," he had said, squeezing her hand gently. "But what about the bet?" Sarah had laughed, a sound of genuine amusement. "The bet was never really about money, was it? It was about whether you could learn to value someone for who they are rather than what they could do for you." Ryan had realized she was right. The financial aspects of his agreement with Jake had become completely irrelevant compared to the personal growth he had experienced through his relationship with Sarah. "So what happens now?" Ryan had asked. "Now," Sarah had said, "we find out whether two people who started with completely different agendas can build something genuine together." It was 6 months later, on a warm evening in San Diego, that Ryan found himself standing in the same officers' club where Jake had first proposed the bet that had changed his life. But this time, he wasn't there to celebrate military achievements or social conquests. He was there to announce his engagement to Lieutenant Sarah Chen. The reaction from his fellow officers had been mixed, but generally positive. Those who knew Sarah professionally respected her capabilities and recognized that Ryan had found someone who complemented his strengths while challenging his weaknesses. Others were simply surprised that the famously ambitious Commander Torres had chosen to marry someone based on personal compatibility rather than social advancement. Jake had approached Ryan near the end of the evening, carrying 2 glasses of whiskey and wearing an expression that mixed satisfaction with genuine happiness for his friend. "So," Jake had said, offering Ryan a glass, "I guess I owe you an apology." Ryan had accepted the whiskey, but looked puzzled. For what? "For treating Sarah like she was just a prop in some kind of experiment," Jake had replied. "I may have started this as a bet, but it's pretty obvious that what you two have built together is real." Ryan had considered Jake's words, recognizing that his friend's assessment was accurate. What had begun as a tactical challenge had evolved into the most meaningful relationship of his life. "Actually," Ryan had said, "I think I owe you a debt of gratitude. If you hadn't pushed me into this situation, I might never have discovered what I was missing." Jake had smiled and raised his glass. "To Sarah Chen, for teaching the great Ryan Torres that some victories are worth more than winning." As they had toasted, Ryan had reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this point. The arrogant officer who had accepted a bet 6 months earlier had been transformed through his relationship with Sarah into someone who understood that true success came not from dominating others, but from finding someone who made him want to be better than he was. The wedding had taken place 3 months later in a small ceremony on the beach near the base. Sarah had insisted on keeping the celebration intimate, with only close friends and family in attendance. Ryan had been surprised to discover that he preferred the personal nature of the ceremony to the large, formal events he had always assumed he would want. During their exchange of vows, Sarah had spoken about finding someone who had the courage to grow and change, while Ryan had talked about discovering that real strength came from being vulnerable enough to let someone else see your flaws and love you anyway. Admiral Patterson, who had agreed to officiate the ceremony, had concluded by observing that military service often taught people about duty and honor, but that the rarest lesson was learning how to build something lasting with another person. As Ryan and Sarah had walked along the beach after the ceremony, both still wearing their dress uniforms, Ryan had found himself thinking about how dramatically his definition of success had changed. "Any regrets?" Sarah had asked, apparently reading his thoughtful expression. Ryan had considered the question, thinking about the path that had brought them together and the challenges they would face as a military couple in an uncertain world. "Only one," he had replied. Sarah had looked concerned. "Which is?" "That it took a bet for me to find you," Ryan had said, pulling her closer as they walked. "I wish I'd been smart enough to look for someone like you on my own." Sarah had laughed, the sound carrying across the water toward the ships anchored in the harbor. "If you'd been that smart already, I probably wouldn't have been interested. I fell in love with your potential for growth, not your existing perfection." Ryan had stopped walking and turned to face her, struck by the profound wisdom in her observation. "And what do you see in my potential now?" Sarah had smiled, her expression reflecting the confidence of someone who had made a carefully considered decision. "I see someone who will continue growing and changing for the rest of his life. Someone who understands that the best victories are the ones you achieve together." As they had resumed walking along the beach, Ryan had felt a deep sense of contentment that was entirely different from any satisfaction he had previously experienced. This wasn't the temporary high of professional achievement or social conquest. It was the sustainable happiness that came from building something meaningful with another person. 5 years later, as Commander Ryan Torres stood on the bridge of his ship, watching his wife coordinate communications for a complex humanitarian mission, he often reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them together. Sarah had been promoted to lieutenant commander and had become one of the Navy's most respected communications specialists, while Ryan had advanced to captain and was being considered for his own battle group command. But their professional achievements, significant as they were, paled in comparison to what they had built together personally. They had learned to support each other's careers while maintaining their individual identities, to balance military duty with personal commitment, and to find strength in their partnership that neither could have achieved alone. The rescue mission they were currently conducting, evacuating civilians from a natural disaster area in Southeast Asia, had become the kind of operation where their combined expertise made them particularly effective. Sarah's communications coordination enabled Ryan to make tactical decisions with confidence, while his command authority gave her the resources she needed to maintain contact with multiple agencies and organizations. "Captain," Sarah had reported during one particularly complex phase of the operation, "we have confirmation that all civilian evacuation points are secure. Medical teams are requesting priority transport for critical patients." Ryan had processed the information quickly, recognizing that Sarah's efficient coordination had given him the situational awareness he needed to optimize their rescue efforts. "Understood. Adjust our approach vector to accommodate medical transport priorities," he had replied, then added with a smile that was visible only to her, "Excellent work, Lieutenant Commander." Sarah had returned his smile, a brief moment of personal connection in the midst of professional operations. It was the kind of interaction that had become natural for them, the ability to maintain their command relationship while acknowledging the deeper partnership that supported it. Later that evening, as they had stood together on the bridge watching the sunset over the South China Sea, Ryan had found himself thinking about the conversation they'd had years earlier about what it meant to care about someone other than yourself. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Jake hadn't made that bet?" he had asked. Sarah had considered the question thoughtfully. "I think we would have found each other eventually. Maybe not as quickly and certainly not in such a dramatic way, but I believe people who are meant to be together usually find a way." Ryan had nodded, recognizing the truth in her observation. "But would I have been ready for you? Or would I have been too focused on my own ambitions to recognize what you had to offer?" "That's the real question, isn't it?" Sarah had replied. "The bet didn't create your capacity for growth. It just forced you to discover it. But that capacity was always there, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge." As they had watched the last light fade from the horizon, Ryan had reflected on how their relationship had continued to evolve and deepen over the years. They had faced the challenges that came with dual military careers, the separations required by different deployments, and the complexity of maintaining personal intimacy while serving in positions of command authority. But each challenge had strengthened their partnership rather than weakening it, because they had learned to approach their relationship with the same commitment to excellence they brought to their professional duties. "I love you," Ryan had said simply, words that had become more meaningful with repetition rather than less. "I love you too," Sarah had replied, leaning against his shoulder as they stood together on the bridge of their ship, two people who had discovered that the greatest victories were the ones they achieved together. What had begun as a bet between friends had become a love story that redefined everything Ryan thought he knew about success, commitment, and the courage required to build something lasting with another person. And as Captain Ryan Torres looked toward the future with Lieutenant Commander Sarah Torres at his side, he knew that their greatest adventures were still ahead of them. The story of their relationship had become something of a legend among their fellow officers. Not because it was perfect, but because it demonstrated that people were capable of fundamental growth when they found the right motivation. Jake often told the story at social gatherings, though he always emphasized that the real lesson wasn't about winning bets, but about having the courage to become the person someone you love deserves. And Sarah, when asked about her perspective on their unconventional beginning, would simply smile and say that sometimes the best things in life start with someone being brave enough to take a chance on something they don't fully understand. What do you think? Did Sarah make the right choice in giving Ryan the opportunity to prove himself? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your opinion. Your participation means so much to us. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more narratives like this. Thank you for watching.